In the winter of 1971, a young couple named Frank and Dorothy Callahan sat at their kitchen table in Pittsburgh, staring at two very different pieces of paper. One was a mortgage document for the modest brick house they had just purchased, showing a debt of $18,000 stretched across 30 years. The other was a savings passbook belonging to Dorothy's uncle Milton, a man who had spent his entire life avoiding debt and trusting only the safety of a bank vault. Milton had warned them for months that borrowing money was a foolish, dangerous decision that would haunt them for decades to come. Frank and Dorothy had listened politely, nodded at the right moments, and then signed the mortgage anyway, because renting forever felt like an even worse trap. What none of them fully understood that winter was that the coming decade would prove one of them catastrophically wrong, and the other, quietly, remarkably right. Milton continued doing exactly what he had always done, depositing a portion of every paycheck into his savings account and watching the balance climb with steady, comforting predictability. He genuinely believed he was the responsible one, the careful one, the man who would end up secure while his careless niece drowned under 3 decades of debt. Frank and Dorothy, meanwhile, made their mortgage payment every single month without fail, watching what felt like a mountain of debt sitting stubbornly on their shoulders. For the first few years, Milton's approach looked like the obvious winner, and the young couple sometimes wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. Then something strange began happening throughout the 1970s that neither Milton nor the Callahans had truly anticipated. Prices started rising faster than almost anyone alive could remember, month after month, year after year, in a pattern that seemed to have no end in sight. Gasoline prices doubled. Grocery bills climbed relentlessly, and wages, slowly but surely, began rising right along with them as employers scrambled to keep workers from falling behind. Frank received raises nearly every year throughout that turbulent decade, not because he had become extraordinarily talented at his job, but simply because his employer needed to match the rising cost of everyday life. His paycheck grew larger and larger, yet his mortgage payment, fixed the day he signed those papers in 1971, never changed by a single dollar. That $18,000 debt, which had once felt like an impossible mountain, began shrinking in real terms with every passing year of inflation. The actual number on the paper stayed exactly the same, but the portion of Frank's rising income required to pay it kept getting smaller and smaller. Milton, meanwhile, was experiencing the exact opposite transformation, though it took him years to fully recognize what was happening to his careful savings. His balance kept growing on paper, just as it always had, giving him the same comforting illusion of security he had relied upon his entire life. But the prices of everything he actually needed to buy were rising even faster than his interest payments could keep pace. Bread, gasoline, and the small comforts he had planned to enjoy in retirement were all quietly slipping further out of reach with every passing year. By 1979, Milton sat down and did something he had never bothered doing before, calculating exactly what his savings could purchase compared to a decade earlier. The number staggered him into a long, uncomfortable silence at his own kitchen table. His dollars had grown, yes, exactly as promised, yet those dollars now bought barely half of what they once could. He had spent 10 careful years working diligently to protect his money, only to watch its real value quietly cut in half by a force he had never been taught to understand. Frank, on the other hand, found himself in an almost unbelievable position by that same year. His fixed mortgage payment, once a source of genuine anxiety, now felt almost laughably small compared to his steadily rising income. The house itself had also increased dramatically in value, following the same inflationary pressure that was driving up prices everywhere else in the economy. Frank and Dorothy had accidentally stumbled into one of the most powerful financial lessons of the entire decade, without ever fully realizing what they had done. Debt, when it carried a fixed interest rate, behaved completely differently during periods of rising prices than most people ever assumed it would. Inflation didn't just fail to hurt Frank's mortgage, it actively worked in his favor, quietly shrinking the real burden of that debt with every single passing year. Milton's cash, by painful contrast, had no such protection built into its very nature. It simply sat there, exposed and vulnerable, absorbing the full force of rising prices with absolutely nothing standing in its way. This wasn't random luck or some rare coincidence limited only to the particular decade Frank and Milton happened to be living through. It reflected a fundamental relationship between debt, savings, and inflation that has repeated itself throughout economic history, again and again, in country after country. When inflation rises, borrowers holding fixed-rate debt often find themselves quietly winning, while diligent savers holding cash often find themselves quietly losing. It is a strange, almost paradoxical truth that goes directly against everything most people are taught to believe about financial responsibility. The disciplined saver, praised and admired throughout Milton's entire life, ended up worse off than the young couple who dared to take on debt. Meanwhile, Frank and Dorothy, once anxious and unsure about their decision, discovered that time and inflation had become quiet, powerful allies working steadily in their favor. By 1980, Milton finally confided in his niece Dorothy about what he had discovered while reviewing his finances late one evening. He admitted, almost embarrassed, that he no longer understood how the financial world he had trusted his entire life actually worked. Dorothy listened patiently, then gently explained something Frank had come to understand, almost by accident, over the previous decade. Inflation didn't simply raise prices in some abstract, disconnected way. It fundamentally altered the relationship between anyone who owed money and anyone who was owed money. A fixed-rate loan, she explained, was essentially a promise to repay a specific number of dollars, regardless of what those dollars could actually purchase in the future. When inflation eroded the value of currency, that fixed promise became easier and easier to fulfill with each passing year of rising wages. Milton sat quietly, absorbing an idea that felt almost backward compared to everything he had believed for decades. He had always viewed debt as a burden and savings as a shield, yet the previous 10 years had proven that assumption dangerously incomplete. Dorothy explained that a lender, the bank or institution that had loaned Frank the money, was actually the one absorbing the hidden cost of inflation. They had agreed to receive a fixed number of dollars back in the future, dollars that would ultimately purchase far less than they had originally intended. Frank, in other words, wasn't simply lucky. He was on the correct side of a transaction that inflation quietly transforms every single year it persists. Milton, holding cash and waiting patiently for interest to accumulate, had unknowingly placed himself on the losing side of that very same transaction. This didn't mean debt was automatically good or that savings were automatically bad, Dorothy carefully clarified for her uncle. It meant that the relationship between the two depended entirely on a force most people rarely considered when making financial decisions in the first place. Milton asked the obvious question that had been building inside him throughout their entire conversation. If holding cash had cost him so much value, what exactly should someone in his position have done differently instead? Dorothy explained that the answer wasn't necessarily to go into reckless debt, but rather to understand that idle cash carried its own quiet, invisible risk. Some of his savings, she suggested, could have been used to acquire real assets, ones capable of rising in value alongside the very prices that were eroding his cash. Real estate, productive businesses, and other tangible assets tended to adjust upward during inflationary periods, unlike static currency sitting untouched in a bank vault. Even a modest fixed-rate loan used to purchase such an asset could have transformed inflation from an enemy into a quiet, powerful ally. Milton began to see his own past decisions through an entirely new lens, one he had never been offered throughout his entire adult life. He hadn't been careless or foolish, exactly as Harold had once believed about himself in a strikingly similar story. He had simply been following a set of rules written for a world where currency held its value with far greater consistency than it actually had during his lifetime. Nobody had ever taught him that those rules could quietly stop working once inflation entered the picture in a serious, sustained way. Frank added something to the conversation that stuck with Milton long after that particular evening had ended. He explained that banks themselves understood this exact relationship extremely well, which was precisely why they charged interest on every loan they issued. Interest rates, Frank explained, were partly the bank's own attempt to protect itself against the very same erosion that had quietly damaged Milton's savings. Yet even with interest included, borrowers still often came out ahead whenever inflation rose faster than anyone had originally anticipated. This created a strange and often overlooked incentive buried within the modern financial system, one that rewarded calculated, productive borrowing over pure, passive saving. It didn't mean every debt was wise, or that every loan represented a good decision. Reckless borrowing for consumption or luxury could still easily destroy a person's finances, regardless of what inflation happened to be doing at any given time. But debt used carefully to acquire real, productive assets could transform what once seemed like a burden into a genuine, long-term advantage. Milton left that conversation with a mixture of regret and cautious optimism, feeling both decades behind and somehow still in time to adjust his course. He began exploring modest ways to shift a portion of his remaining savings into assets less vulnerable to the quiet erosion he had personally experienced firsthand. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, nor did it happen overnight in any meaningful sense, but it represented the same quiet shift in understanding that had once helped families like Harold's finally break free from a trap they had never even realized they were caught inside. Over the next several years, Milton slowly restructured a portion of his savings, moving cautious amounts into a small rental property and a handful of stable, dividend-paying stocks. It felt uncomfortable at first, almost like betraying every principle he had followed for nearly 50 years of careful, disciplined living. But by the mid-1980s, he began noticing something he hadn't experienced in years. A quiet sense that his money was finally working in step with the world around it, rather than constantly falling behind. The rental property's value climbed alongside the same inflationary pressures that had once quietly drained his cash, and the modest rent he collected each month rose right along with it. Frank and Dorothy, meanwhile, continued benefiting from that same fixed mortgage long after inflation had cooled from its most extreme highs of the previous decade. Their monthly payment, locked in place since 1971, had become almost trivial compared to their combined household income by the time the 1980s came to a close. They eventually paid off the house entirely, owning a property that had multiplied several times over in value, while the actual debt they repaid had effectively shrunk in real terms throughout the entire process. Milton, watching this unfold from the sidelines of his own family, finally understood the lesson in a way that no lecture or warning ever could have taught him. Debt and savings were never simply good or bad in some fixed, universal sense that applied equally to every situation and every era. Their true value depended entirely on the invisible force moving quietly beneath them, a force capable of turning one into a hidden advantage and the other into a silent, creeping loss. This lesson eventually spread throughout the rest of the Callahan family, shaping decisions for an entire generation that followed after Frank and Dorothy. Their children grew up hearing the story of Uncle Milton's careful savings and their own parents' seemingly reckless mortgage, told and retold at holiday dinners for decades afterward. The lesson wasn't that debt was always safe, or that savings were always dangerous, since either extreme could easily lead a family toward financial ruin under the wrong circumstances. The real lesson was that money itself was never truly neutral, no matter which side of a transaction a person happened to occupy. Every dollar owed and every dollar saved existed in constant motion relative to inflation, quietly gaining or losing real value depending on forces that most people never stopped to examine closely. Understanding this relationship didn't require an economics degree or years of specialized financial training reserved for experts. It required only a willingness to ask a deeper question whenever prices began climbing throughout the broader economy around them. Who benefits when currency loses value, and who quietly bears the cost of that same ongoing erosion? Milton often reflected, in his later years, on how differently his entire financial life might have unfolded had someone explained this relationship to him decades earlier. He hadn't lacked discipline, effort, or good intentions at any point throughout his long, careful life. He had simply lacked a single, crucial piece of understanding, one capable of completely reshaping how he approached every financial decision he had ever made. That missing piece, once finally revealed, changed not only his own remaining years, but the entire financial trajectory of the family members who came after him. Frank and Dorothy's story, much like countless others scattered throughout modern economic history, illustrates a pattern that repeats itself again and again across different decades and different economies. Inflation rarely announces a clear winner or loser at the moment any single financial decision is actually made. Instead, it reveals its verdict slowly, quietly, over years and even decades, rewarding those who understood its true nature, while punishing those who never learned to see it coming. The disciplined saver isn't always the responsible one, and the borrower isn't always the reckless one, contrary to nearly everything most people are casually taught to believe. The real determining factor lies buried in the relationship between fixed obligations, rising prices, and the quiet, relentless passage of time itself. Those who learn to recognize that relationship early gain a genuine, lasting advantage that compounds steadily across an entire lifetime. Those who never learn it, like Milton for the first 50 years of his adult life, often discover the painful truth only after decades of quiet, invisible erosion have already taken their toll. And by then, as Milton himself came to understand all too well, the most valuable lesson of all is simply refusing to let that same silent mistake repeat itself in the generations still waiting to come.